Welcome back to Let's Make a Game, a channel about making computer role-playing games using the free program Twine and the Sugarcube format for Twine. In this video, I would like to talk about a design principle which I have been reminded of when making my current project, the Fighting Fantasy Rules adapted to a Twine game using the Sword and Planet subgenre of science fiction, although this is not specific to any of that. This is a principle that is useful for any game which uses a choose your own adventure style format or a game book style format. And that is that you should beware of having too much story in between the choices. And it's very easy to forget that, and sometimes it's easy to forget that because of a good idea you've had. In other words, you think of a really cool story idea and you want that to happen, and it may be a really good story idea, but because you're sort of excited by that and sort of hyped up for that, you don't think about, well, this is really a game where the player makes choices and sees what those choices, see what happens as a result of those choices, or as a result of those choices interacting with the mechanics of the game. Similarly, you can have good ideas for a branching story, a good idea of how to branch. You go, oh, I could roll a die and compare that to this score, and then that makes sense as to how that would branch these things off. But again, if it is if there's too much of that without any player input, the player can feel like they're just sort of clicking and watching the story run itself, almost, that they're not in control, they're not making choices. Now, when we're using a computer format, as we are, as opposed to hoping to print an actual book, that makes those mechanics a lot more forgiving, because I can write a game where it says roll against your skill, and then whether you succeed or fail, roll against your luck, and then whether the success or failure of those two will give us 4 different branches. And maybe one of those branches I could say, all right, well, if you've got this item, go here, and if you don't have the item, go here. And for another branch, I could say, well, if you have this particular keyword or something, go here, and if not, go here. And they could all be very good ideas. They could all be that could be a really good way of making that item important. And that could be a really good way of making skill important and luck important, or whatever the stats that I use are. But the player is not making any choice. And if they are, if it's a book, especially, as opposed to a computer game, that's going to count a lot. Because remember that just about every step has to be turning to a different page. So the player's going to go, okay, roll against my skill. Okay, I succeeded. I turned to 328. They flip through that. Maybe it takes a bit of back and forth to get to 328. 328, test my luck. Okay, I'll test my luck. I was unlucky. Okay, I go to 415 or whatever. Again, there's a few seconds of flipping back and forth before they get to 415. 415, do you have the Eye of Argon? Yes, I do actually have that. Okay, I'll just check my sheet. Yep, I do have that. Okay, go to 28. Okay, and then if they don't get a choice there, they've sort of been just flipping back and forth for a few minutes, not making any choices. And they can, at that point, I personally would start to go, well, I'd like to make a choice. I'd like to not just be sort of going through this book in a random. I'm really just reading a book, but in a random order. It doesn't feel like a choose your own adventure. It doesn't have the thing that makes these games interesting, which a normal story doesn't have. And if the player has sought out a book like this, well, presumably that's what they want. You know, if people were content to just hear a story, well, that's a book. They can get a book anywhere, right? They can read a story anywhere, or watch a video or an audio book, or, you know, they're sport for choice. But they've come to this, and that is presumably, even though people say, oh, I read this because I like the story and I like the setting. Yeah, they do, but they like the story and the setting and the choices, right? Otherwise, they would probably be reading a conventional story. There are a lot of conventional stories that have, you know, good settings and good plots and stuff. If they seek out a book of this type, a story of this type, that means they want to make choices and see what effect those choices have. Having said that, in a computer game, it's a little bit more forgiving, because you're not flipping back and forth. You can just present that in one hit. You can just say, roll against your skill, you succeeded. Roll against, test your luck, you failed. And then it prints the text. It doesn't take any longer than if there hadn't been any of those branches. Unless you have branching and then a block of text, and they have to click to continue, and then there's another block of text, and then they have to click to continue. When you, or even if you just have a paragraph, and then they test their skill, and a paragraph, and then they test their luck, and then another paragraph. So, in other words, what I'm trying to say is, in a book, that sort of multiple branching that's not a player choice is always going to be bad, or almost always going to be bad. In a game, it's a lot more forgivable unless the player has to read a lot of text. So having or click a lot of buttons, just click to continue. If it's just, well, you did make 4 different saves, but the game just prints them up one after the other and then prints some text. Well, that experience is just the same as if they'd made a choice and just straight up got the text, right? It happens instantly. It does take a certain amount of time. It doesn't literally take 0 time, but the time it takes is so small on a human scale that the player will experience it as being exactly the same as if they'd just gone straight to the paragraph. So when you are making a computer game, as we are, we have a lot of slack that we don't have when we're making a book. But we still have to be aware that we can fall into this trap. And specifically, I would say that we fall into this trap when the player has to read a lot of text as a result of these saves. So if it's like, let's say, how much money do you have? Okay, we'll have a branching based on a save versus social class. Let's say that. You save versus social class, you fail, then there's a big bit of text that says you're taken prisoner and you're in a big jail, and then you have a trial, and then you have to save against charisma or something like that, and you fail, you're found guilty, and then they have to read a bunch of text about that, and then they have to click to continue, and then there's another save. Well, that is an example of a situation where they're going to start to think, or are likely to start to think, hang on, wasn't I meant to be making choices here? Whereas you could have exactly the same mechanics. You could have save versus social class, save versus charisma, save versus something else. And if they're just presented one after the other, and then you get a little bit of text, if it just briefly says you're arrested and tried and convicted or something, and here you are on a work gang or whatever may be happening in the story, well, that is fine, as long as it doesn't take more time for the player to sort of get through that branching. Because we're doing it on a computer, we can get the player through that branching very, very, very quickly, and so we're not falling into that trap. And of course, sometimes there's going to be borderline cases. Is this too much? When I say too much text, how much is too much text? Well, that's what playtesting is for. You know, that's why you run through it and try to honestly think about, okay, is this just a lot of clicking? Because, you know, when you were designing it, you go, of course, save versus social class. That's a really ideal way to use this attribute that I don't use very much, and I wanted to have this be part of the game. Great! This is a really good mechanic. A really good thing to put in the story. And so when you're making it, you're excited as a designer. You're excited about you found this very elegant way to use this stat that you didn't have, or whatever you found. But of course, the player's not going to be excited by that. They're excited by exploring the world and seeing what happens. So when you play test it and you put on your player hat, as it were, and you get into that mentality, you might sort of notice, there's a lot of clicking here, isn't there? There's a lot of reading a paragraph and then making a saving roll and then clicking and seeing what happens, and not a lot of making choices. So, as it so often is, what is too much and what is just enough but not too much is something that it's not something you can do mathematically. It's something you have to discover by playtesting. Testing it yourself, and then hopefully the project keeps going and you get other people to test it and give you feedback, and there's enough interest in it that people take that up. But as a rule of thumb, I guess what I wanted to say is if you're having sort of more than a couple of branching, more than a couple of bits of text that doesn't have any choice in it, you should look at what you've done and look at changing it. So what I want to do with the rest of this video, and why we're looking at this sort of blank word processing document, is I wanted to show an example of getting out of that, of fixing something like that. And this is an example that's largely based on what I was doing recently. So in the game that I'm writing, you may come to live with these sort of gorilla-like aliens that are sort of big, green, gorilla-type creatures. I guess kind of like Chewbacca, broadly, from Star Wars, or Yetis or something like that. That sort of big, hairy, primitive sort of trope, I suppose. Or Bigfoot, I suppose, for people in America. And eventually you really want to see a human face, right? You quite like these creatures, but you miss humans pretty much. And I thought one way to do that is we have a human trader turns up. And I thought, okay, so what happens then? The human trader can take you to the city, and maybe what happens then depends on the respect that the creatures have for you, which we've been tracking as a stat, essentially. So if the stat is low, we could say trader sells you into slavery. I had the idea that you had to be a gladiator in the arena because that's a real Sword and Planet trope, and I'm trying to include as many Sword and Planet tropes as I can. John Carter seems to be forced to fight in an arena, quite often, and he always, he loves it because he's a magnificent swordsman and he sort of, destroys everyone and everyone thinks he's great. But that seems to be a trope, perhaps of fantasy generally, maybe, but it seems like it's a Sword and Planet thing in particular. All right, so we could say the trader sells you into slavery. Trader just sort of takes you to the city and leaves you there, or the trader gets you a job, right? So we have 3 results there, and if you want to have more than 2 outcomes, the mechanic that I've been using is you roll a die, 1d, and you add respect, and then so If that total is low, then you get sold into slavery. If it's medium, takes you to the city. If it's high, gets you a job. So the in-game, what's happening in the fiction of the game there is if the apes don't respect you, they say, yeah, to take this horrible person off our hands and do whatever you want with him. If they respect you a lot, presumably they said, we want you to take this person and we want you to take him to the city and we want you to, absolutely take care of him, and we will find out. And if you haven't, if he comes to harm, you'll be our enemy or something like that. And so therefore he, presumably being a slightly unscrupulous person, he will sell you into slavery if he can, get you a job if he has to, and otherwise just take you to the city and say, good luck, enjoy the rest of your life. And then I thought, well, this is a good way to use a couple of the character traits that I talked about when you set up a character. Characters have advantages and disadvantages, and most of those advantages and disadvantages aren't mechanical. They're not bonuses or penalties to your attributes. A couple of them are, but most of them are character traits, like you have trouble keeping your mouth shut, or you sometimes suspect people of ill intent even when they don't have ill intent, or another one of them is too trusting of people who want to do them harm because they've grown up on a farm and they're a little bit sheltered from people like that. So I thought, okay, well, if you get sold into slavery, maybe the trusting one, maybe everyone gets, got on the wrong line there. Maybe I could say everyone gets a skill roll to avoid that, other than, oh my God, sorry. There we go. That's other than farm character. So we roll and die and add respect. If we get the worst bracket of results, then we would have branching based on what character you've got. And if you're the farm character, you go straight to the trade has sold you into slavery section. If you're anyone else, you get a skill roll. And if you succeed, then you kind of suspect them along the way. And that would be the same as if you got the medium result. You sneak off in the morning or something when they're asleep or something like that. And if you fail the skill roll, then you're sold into slavery. And similarly, the detective character, the one who suspects the worst of people sometimes when that's not what's happening, we could say detective gets a skill roll. And if they fail, they get suspicious and they again abandon the trader, this time to their disadvantage. So they get the medium outcome when they would otherwise have gotten the good outcome if they either made their skill roll or it was a different character. So, and I was very pleased with that. I thought that was very elegant. Here's a way to have these advantages and disadvantages be part of the game, which I hadn't done yet, and it sort of makes sense. Like, yep, that's a good use of respect. That seems like a good use of skill. I mean, albeit skill is a very broad attribute, so a lot of things are good uses of skill, but and it all, it's all quite elegant, and it doesn't have to take a lot of text. I can do this and the skill roll. I can do all that in one hit, probably. Nonetheless, I did think perhaps sort of in conjunction with the previous, because I'd had a couple of other bits of text, the bit where I had to explain that you stay with them for several months, you learn their language. Oops. That was quite long. You learn their language. Because I was skipping over several months of time within the fiction of the game, You learn your language, you learn that there are 3 species, you learn their names. So there's sort of quite a lot happening up here. And so I thought having a fairly long bit of text and then it turns into some more mechanics that aren't a choice. It felt like too long without a choice. And I wasn't happy with this structure as it was. Even though this bit, in a game book, that would probably be a bit much, because you'd be, as I said before, you'd be flipping back and forth, and this would probably take 4 or 5 paragraphs. But in a computer version of it, it's all reported instantly, so it's fine. That in conjunction with this quite long bit of text here didn't seem to me to be using the gamebook format to its best advantage. It seemed like it was a bit long without a choice. So I wanted to have a choice. And so I thought to myself, well, why don't we make the human trader turning up the result of a choice? So that suggests, well, you can stay or you can wait. All right, and then if you wait, the human trader turns up. That was the first thing I thought. Okay, I mean, that satisfies the problem. That satisfies one problem, or solves one problem. Or at least we don't have too long without a choice, or at least I've broken up this stretch without a choice. But now we have another problem. If we wait and the human trader turns up, well, if the player has a high enough respect, they'll soon learn that they should wait. And so, sorry, stay and wait. What I meant was, I've said the same thing twice. Leave. Actually, let's put that in capitals so it's easier to tell. Yeah, so you can leave straight away and sort of schlep through the jungle, brave the dangers of the jungle, or you can wait and the human trader turns up, and then it depends on the respect that you have. And that's fair enough. You could say, well, if the player has a high respect, they should wait, and they can learn that, and that's fine. But I think because it's from my testing, it seems a little bit easy to get a high respect, and I don't know if that's going to turn out to be true when I start automated testing, or when I play test the game a few more times. But that's the impression I get, and so I still wasn't quite happy with that. So I thought, all right, I'll tell you what we'll do. If we wait, we'll test our luck. And if we're lucky, the human trader turns up. And if we're unlucky, then something else bad happens. There's a raid by a third species, the third species that I was kind of wanting to put in this setting, these sort of insect-like creatures. So that way, if you wait, you have to both sacrifice a little bit of luck, because when you test your luck, you lose 1 luck, and you have to have a high enough luck that you can expect to be lucky, and you have to have high respect. And that seemed a bit more balanced, because leaving straight away is going to involve wandering through the jungle. And the way that I was thinking about it was that would be very dangerous, as of course it would be in real life. Wandering through a jungle that you are not prepared for is going to be, even on Earth, just wandering through a national park, right? Wandering through a forest in your home country would be very dangerous, and people do die doing that. But wandering through a jungle where there are actual wild animals and sort of, well, I suppose there are wild animals in some national parks, but a jungle like the Amazon where, fairly large predators roam fairly freely, right? That's obviously going to be more dangerous. And if you've just been transported to an alien planet and you don't even know the basics of life on this world, well, that's probably going to be more dangerous again, right? Being an alien and not knowing that, I don't know, not knowing that deserts are hot, all this sort of knowledge that we just kind of pick up. So because this one's very dangerous, you don't want to have one dangerous option and one safe option, because then players will very quickly learn to just take the safe option. You want them to be about as dangerous as each other, and hopefully that they reward different stats, so that the player can make a sort of intelligent decision. If you have them both be as dangerous as each other, but you're doing much the same thing to survive, you're in each one, like you're rolling against your skill or something, well, that's not really a choice. It's just a sort of cosmetic choice. Mechanically, it's, you might as well choose one as the other. So what you want is that they're roughly equally dangerous or rewarding, but that perhaps if you've got a high skill, you're better off going this way, and if you've got a high respect, you're better off going that way. So, of course, we can't tell until we playtest it, but this seems to be a better way to do it. We'll have waiting, and if you wait, you test your luck, and then a human trader turns up, and all this stuff still happens, but we've broken it. We've put a choice in between this quite long text and this stuff. And there's a lot of different roles here, but because this is a computer game rather than a game book, that'll all just be sort of printed out in one hit. It won't take any longer, at least it won't take any longer that the player can notice anyway. And so that will be fine. And then eventually, because thinking about this stuff, so often you think of, oh, well, there's extra stuff as well. I thought, well, we could leave without telling the aliens, and we could leave telling the aliens, and then that could have a different outcome. Leaving telling them, well, that involves another roll and respect with different results. But because the character stuff doesn't come into it, the odds of which one's better or worse will be slightly different depending on what character you're playing, and that's what you want. You don't want there to be a best choice and a not as good choice. You want a choice that's good for some characters and a choice that's good for other characters, if you can do that. So you can leave without telling the aliens, you can leave telling them, or you can wait, and then if you wait, to stop it being the obvious best choice, you have to test your luck. And unlucky means there's a raid and there'll be some sort of dangerous combat. I haven't written this bit yet. Perhaps a chance that you might be taken by these sort of ant-like creatures and enslaved. Ant-like creatures that enslave people seems to be a bit of a science fiction trope, I think. I can't name any stories where it happens, but I have a feeling that that's a trope, that the ants sort of take over and humans have to be their slaves, or the insects perhaps in general take over and humans have to sort of be their thralls. So that is an example of how to break things up. Like, look at if it's too much text, think about, well, what's a choice the player could make in between this, rather than A leading to B, have A leading to a choice that might lead to B, if you can do it. Try and think about a way that you can intercede a choice in there if the progression from A to B is going to be wearyingly long. Speaking of wearyingly long, this video has been quite long, so I might leave it there. As I said, I've done more stuff in the story. I've done basically what I've told you about here. So if you're interested in sort of checking out what little of the game there is so far, you can certainly download that from the itch.io link, which is in the description of this video. Or if you're interested in looking at the code, how I turned this sort of plan into actual instructions for the computer. But for now, I hope that was useful or interesting to at least some of you, and I hope you'll tune in next time.